then, we'll make a start. So thank you everyone for joining us today and for registering for this webinar. Today we are joined by Isabel from a company called Visitor Insights. In the last webinar, we were speaking with a company called Cisco Meraki about footfall counting equipment that the Welsh Government has been offering each local authority to be able to collect footfall data for their towns across Wales. And today, Isabel is going to talk to us about how best to make use of this footfall data, how decisions can be made based on this footfall data, and really taking a deep dive into the data and telling us a bit more about how you could potentially make data-driven decisions based on this footfall data. Like I've just said, please feel free to ask as many questions as you like. We do have a slot at the end to ask these questions, but do use the chat function to make sure that these questions do get asked at the end. So with that being said, I'll hand it over to you then, Isabel.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Let me just share my presentation with you all. Right, as mentioned, today's webinar is essentially going to be looking at ways that you can use footfall data actually in combination with a number of other data sources to drive data-driven decision making. A couple of points before I kick off. This webinar is very much focused around data, so there'll be quite a lot of data on screen, not all of which we will go through data point by data point. So what I've done is I included quite a lot of text as well in this presentation to help you actually understand the data, but actually importantly, so you can take this presentation away with you in hard copy format. I'll send it round after today's session and actually spend a bit more time going through that data, but also having accompanying narrative with it. So you don't need to take a huge amount of notes during this session. So to kick things off, front and center of this presentation will be really understanding how you can use data, footfall data, but also human behavioural data to really understand some of the challenges and opportunities faced in your town centres. We're going to be focusing on how visitor data can be used specifically to shape sustainable and resilient places, increase town centre engagement, and importantly prioritise town centre strategies and capital investment. So some of the things we're going to be going through will be an introduction to Visitor Insights, so what we do, who we are, looking at some high-level visitor trends and actually some of the differences that you can see and understand by really taking a deep dive into the data. An overview of data sources. So whilst you'll have footfall counters, I'm aware that you are also using other data sources across your towns and cities to really get an understanding of who the visitors are and how they're interacting with spaces, but also a general overview of some other data sources that you might consider to have that really people-centered approach to shaping strategy in town centres. And then to bring that data to life and what we'll discuss in the first couple of sections are some case studies. So the case studies we'll be looking at today will focus on Bangor, a town centre that we've provided some information for to understand COVID impact, as well as an Ashton, slightly larger and more complex case study, but just to sort of show you the two ends of data interpretation, and then hopefully some question time at the end. But as mentioned, any questions you have throughout the course of the presentation, just do pop them in the chat function. So to start things off, Visitor Insights. So we are a geolocation data company. So what that means at high level is we essentially take signals that are emitted from handheld devices via GPS to satellites to essentially build a picture of human movement throughout the entirety of the UK. So we do look at footfall to and obviously an understanding of movement, but actually it's a lot more than just footfall. It's information around how people move around space, the locations they interact with, where else they're going when they're not in an area, where they come from, where they go to. So essentially we're mapping and analysing, dynamic visitor behaviour that gives you a bit more than just footfall. But who we are as a company in terms of our specialism is actually taking a really deep dive into the data. So there'll be some elements that I show you that we can look at, and you'll be able to understand and analyze through the data sources that you have already at your fingertips, but there'll also be the inclusion of data in some of the examples that I show you, that are data that essentially other businesses similar to ours or us can source. So to start things off, I thought it was interesting to show you some of the sort of visitor trends that we've seen across different location types in 2021, so that's January to November, versus that same period in 2019, to really show you how looking at different sources of data can actually ensure that you have a very localized and specific understanding of how a place is performing, especially, I keep saying in this post-pandemic environment, we're not quite post-pandemic yet, but since lockdown, and actually then start building a picture of a place, and then the interventions and town centre strategies that should be applied to locations, but on a very specific basis. So first and foremost, we've looked at city centres. So we've taken a large cross-section of city centres throughout the entirety of the UK, including Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland and England, and essentially looked at actually some of the trends. So the first box that you see at the top in terms of city centres paints a pretty negative picture of cities throughout the UK. So decline in footfall, dwell time, shrinkage of catchment, and actually a massive decline in terms of regular visitors. But what I really wanted to show is actually taking a more specific approach to understanding a place can actually show you some different trends. So we've looked at then segmenting those cities into cities that have a really high proportion of office workers versus cities that actually drive a bit more of a touristic element through having some really significant cultural and heritage sites and areas of interest. And hopefully this sort of showcases how different locations can perform, albeit sort of within that same sort of city bucket. So those that had significant proportion of office workers still showing really negative trends in terms of that return to pre-pandemic behaviours and footfall levels. But actually, interestingly, those that had a significant cultural interest bucked the trend really in that sort of wider city centre bucket, where there was actually an increase in footfall. Dwell time remained pretty much similar to what we were seeing in 2019. And actually, really importantly, there was an increase in the catchment radius in some of those cities compared to 2019 levels. Taking a similar look at town centres, again, taking a town centre as a whole, town centres have inversely fared a little bit better than cities, specifically in terms of increase of regular visitors. So the catchments have actually drawn more visitors than in 2019, but overall, bit of a negative picture in terms of dwell time and in terms of footfall. But again, a very, very different picture if you look at different town centre types. So commuter town centres that historically were probably seeing a year-on-year decline in terms of footfall, dwell time and catchment engagement really benefited from the reduction of people going to city centres for work purposes, and saw a really increased profile in terms of their footfall, how long people were spending in the town centre, and actually their leakage to other competing retail areas. And I just draw your eye to the graph on the right-hand side that showed that while city centres were really still lagging behind in terms of visits to specific occupiers, retail, grocery, F&B, leisure and services, actually that's benefited town centres, especially the commuter towns, who have seen, again, an uptick in terms of their engagement they've seen to leisure and entertainment services. So actually, a positive impact brought about by some of the negative trends seen in some of those, worker-heavy city centres. And then inversely, looking at, community schemes, very different trends there in terms of just that overall town centre location type. Again, looking at tourist towns and the final location type that we're looking at as from these examples today. Again, tourist towns, have really benefited by and large from the reduction of and the limitation of travel in 2021. So seeing an increase in footfall, but again, drawing your eye to the two sub-location types, coastal and historic. Actually, you can see that it's the coastal towns that attracted far more footfall, and whilst historic towns certainly did have an increase in footfall, that change has not been as marked, and actually have experienced some slight differences in terms of the engagement to specific types of occupier. So actually, coastal towns, whilst benefiting from a big increase in footfall, that footfall clearly was not necessarily going to local businesses. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, there's only been a slight increase in engagement to food and beverage and leisure occupiers, which probably alludes to the fact that most of that increased footfall was seen actually on the coast rather than having a positive economic impact on the town, whereas actually, albeit historic towns had a less marked increase in footfall, most of that footfall was clearly going to those town centre businesses. So the food and beverage providers, leisure and services. So actually a very nuanced picture of how footfall has impacted these locations, what that's meant in terms of local economy, and actually what that might mean for the future in terms of strategies employed by these different types of locations to really not just drive footfall, but actually drive positive economic impact in those locations. So we're going to talk now a little bit about actually the data, some of the data that we've just seen and some of the data that you have available to you, but also that you might consider to get a really well-rounded approach. And first and foremost, in terms of understanding positive and future-proof strategies for town and city centres across Wales is really having a people-centred approach. So all the data that you should be looking at should really be trying to understand how people use the town centre, why they use the town centre, and in fact addressing some of these questions. So a lot of questions here, but this is really what you should be asking, of your data. So really understanding local usage. So where do visitors travel from? How far do they travel? Actually, a point that's not in here: who is not visiting your town centre? Where are those locations where there is a lack or a decline in engagement? Those who are visiting, what local services and amenities are driving the highest footfall? Where's that demand? And actually the inverse, where are you seeing a decline in engagement and actually areas of potential risk or areas that might be impacting footfall in the long term? How does access impact usage? And again, as I mentioned, which areas of the town centres are under visited? Looking at movement, where and when has there been an increase and a decrease in footfall? Is that a result of local competition or local retail centres impacting visitor levels? Do you have a lot of cross catchments between some of your locations, and what does that mean for visitation in one area or another? And that actually, can there be an improved connection between town centres in the area, or at least a shaping of a town centre's purpose, so each location serves a unique purpose to its community and to its visitors? In terms of employment, you should really be asking your data, where did the worker population come from? Where has that changed over time? How are they using transport hubs? But actually, importantly, how do workers in your town centre provide a positive impact to footfall and the local economy? Is there a connection between business areas and a town centre, or can that be improved? And then really importantly, is the community element. So actually the community around your town and city centre, is there a high level of engagement with local communities and local residents, as well as a desire to obviously improve and widen catchments? How has that engagement changed? I think COVID has really shown how there's been a huge hugely disparate set of factors in terms of local engagement. So, as we saw earlier, a massive reduction in terms of catchments and local engagement in city centres, but actually on the inverse, a really positive increase in local engagement for some of the smaller locations. So what does your town and city centre say about local engagement in the local community? Have there been any council interventions, either pre or sort of post, I keep saying post-COVID, not quite post-COVID, but pre or post-lockdown, that have actually impacted footfall? That could be positively or negatively, and then trying to understand what can be avoided or what can be replicated. Are there footfall level changes that are different in different areas? So again, some of the metrics we looked at did arguably look at the town centre or the local area as a whole, but actually are there pockets of increase and pockets of decrease, and why is that happening? And again, are there any missing uses that could be driving footfall, driving engagement, that should be considered as part of a town plan? Some of the data sources that could actually be considered to answer some of those questions are, of course, footfall. You'll have footfall sensors where you'll be able to understand, and actually with the right placement of those footfall sensors, understand visitor levels and changes in visitor levels in key areas around your town and city centres. Geolocation data, so data such as ours, can then provide that added element of in-depth information around movement, around behaviours, and around that sort of wider picture of where else people are going, as well as where they come from. Historic and local benchmarking data, so wherever that comes from, whether that's footfall, whether that's geolocation data, whether that's publicly available information, but really understanding how there have been changes to the visitor behaviours, as well as I would encourage data sharing between communities. So how is your town centre faring compared to other similar locations? Are you seeing similar trends, or are there different trends, and why are you seeing different trends in terms of engagement across those locations? Really understanding visitor profiles again and changes over time. So that can be done using demographic data, as well as app user data. I understand that there are user apps being employed in town centres where a lot of this information can be gathered about not just how many people are coming to a location, but actually who they are. Again, really crucial in terms of understanding town centre users, but also those who aren't using a town centre, and how there can be strategies employed to encourage increased usage from people who aren't really engaging with the space. And then really importantly, actually understanding away from just that desktop-based data, preferences and opinions. So again, that can be done via desktop-based information. So again, your app user data, geolocation data can start understanding and essentially create a great picture of what places people are using, but actually also data. And I know one of your town centres is actually trialling the Maybe platform, maybe actually one of the a provider that we work with quite regularly, but understanding that engagement from a social media perspective, actually, as well as physically engaging with people, which arguably is quite difficult in a situation where we are continuing to social distance and there is still a worry from COVID. But actually, with all of this desktop data, you can understand patterns, you can understand usage, you can really do deep dives into how a space is functioning. But at the core of developing really robust, future-proofed and community-focused town centre strategies is actually people's opinions and preferences. So in one of the examples that I'll show you from one of the case studies, you'll see that actually all of the desktop-based data that we provided was also cross-analysed with responses that we got from physical surveys. So we asked people, what they liked, what they didn't like, what they wanted out of their town centre, and what would actually increase and improve their accessibility and engagement for the space. So I suppose the takeaway from this slide is actually just really ensuring that you've got a cohesive and joined up approach to your data sources. So whilst I know we're talking about footfall very much today, I just want to hammer home the importance of having sources of data that essentially work together to give you a really well-rounded picture of your space. So the case studies we're going to be going through today, as I mentioned, Bangor and Ashton, really focusing on, essentially revitalising town centres and looking at how both there's been, an impact from COVID, but actually what that then means for strategies going forwards, and how to use our understanding of data to focus in on the key interventions in spaces and places that are going to really bring about that change through having in-depth data, but also really understanding what that data means. So just to take you through a report that we did. So again, just a caveat in these case studies, they are relatively long in terms of their reports. So I've handpicked a couple of elements that I thought would be most interesting to present as part of today's webinar. So we did some reports actually just with geolocation data in early 2021, looking at a historic data set for a number of locations in Wales, Bangor being one of them, where really we wanted to quantify and understand what the impact of COVID had been. So we looked at 2020. So we're going to show you some of the slides, some of the data we created for 2020, but actually the report went back to 2017 and 2016 to try and understand what the impact had been, but actually what the situation was in these spaces before lockdown in early 2020, to really try and understand what the longer term trends have been, and actually then really measure impact, not just in 2020, but also with a previous historic view of what was happening in these spaces and places. So I did warn you, lots of data, so I don't propose to go through all of this data with you. And as I said, I will sort of share it after, so you can have a bit more of an in-depth look at the information yourselves. But by and large, this is the overview, the summary of some of the data we pulled together for Bangor. So we were looking at footfall, but also changes in dwell time, the number of places people visited when they were coming to the town centre, the frequency, and actually some of the changes in terms of behaviours. So hours of the day that people came versus 2019, and actually the most popular days of the week, which actually in this example didn't change, but we did see that happen in a number of locations across the UK. Some interesting takeaways from Bangor actually were that there was a really marked decline in footfall, which is something we saw nationwide. Again, a decline in terms of dwell time, so people were making trips that were a lot more focused, and there was probably a lot less mulling around. A slight decline in places visited, but actually a really positive trend that we saw here, where actually there were, still quite a high level of engagement with occupiers in the town centre. Actually, one of the really positive things we did see, however, is that there was an increase in the number of visits people made in 2020 compared to previous years. And actually, why that is was really twofold. One, that there were far less infrequent visitors, so people making infrequent trips to Bangor from catchments that were further afield, greatly reduced. But actually, there was also an increase in engagement and more frequent visitors made from a local catchment. So whilst the footfall declined, Bangor actually benefited from having a much more engaged local visitor base compared to what it saw prior to 2020, where there was a wider but slightly more dispersed catchment of people who may only come, a couple of times a year. We broke that data down into to look at really the impact, and you can see the huge impact obviously that COVID had in terms of visitor numbers, but again how that changed throughout the year. One of the sort of key takeaways here was actually how much the announcements really impacted footfall in town centres, so that could really help essentially with the management and understanding of visitor numbers in the town, both from a safety perspective, but actually also the occupiers themselves, so understanding when they would see a big drop off in terms of visitor numbers, what that meant for staff levels and employment in the town centre, as well as that general management piece. Again, we looked at dwell time, so really understanding month on month the impact again of the announcements of various lockdowns in terms of how long people were spending in the town centre. And again, similarly to footfall, and actually used in conjunction with footfall, that really helped with an understanding of behaviours, as well as trying to I suppose, predict the impact of the lockdowns in 2021 and what that would mean for local businesses, the local economy, usability and take up of transport infrastructure, the number of people who would be around the town centre, cars coming into the town centre. So lots of uses for this data. Catchment is something I've mentioned a couple of times. So this is a visualization essentially of the visitors, home locations coming to Bangor. The map on the left-hand side is 2020 and the map on the right-hand side is 2019. And this really shows us, as you can see, that there was an increase in terms of local residents. So this map only shows us where the top 50% of visitors comes from. And whilst it looks like there are more visitors in 2020 than 2019, what this shows us is that actually the concentration of visitors in 2020 was far more local than in 2019, where actually the catchment of concentrated visitors was a lot smaller from a local base, but actually there were far more visitors coming from areas further afield in Wales as well as the rest of the UK. So again, helped understand, the fact that there were more local people engaging with a town centre, and then obviously that data can be used to really shape strategies and shape an understanding of who's using the town centre and how a town centre can accommodate improved usage from a local resident base. And then we've taken those two maps and essentially layered them on top of each other, so you can really see what I mean here in terms of increased local visitors. So on the left-hand side, we can essentially see the green showing that there are more visitors from those locations than the previous year, and the red essentially shows us there are less visitors from those locations than the previous year. So again, you can see just that influx of local resident visitors to Bangor compared to the periods we saw prior to lockdown in 2020. So that was a very data heavy example, and I know the town centres took that information and merged it with some of their own data sets to really drive an understanding of the impact of COVID from a safety and an economic perspective, but also help predict some of the impacts going in 2021, and equally the areas that saw some benefits as well as negatives from COVID. The Ashton example I'm going to show you is actually then an example of where we've done that. So we've taken our geolocation data and we've merged it with other data sets to really actually focus in on core areas of transformational change in the town centre, to try and phase some of the capital investments, to really focus on what's going to have the largest impact, as well as what will be easiest to introduce based on the information that we have in terms of usage, and in terms of how best to make the most out of the town centre. So it all starts with footfall. So the map you see here is essentially a mapping of pedestrian flow throughout the town centre. Red is where you've got the highest number of pedestrians, all the way down to blue where you've got the lowest number of pedestrians. We mapped this throughout the entirety of Ashton town centre to really understand what flow was, and actually importantly what the connections were from a pedestrian visitor base between some of the key areas in the town centre. So just to any of those of you not familiar with Ashton, which there probably aren't a huge amount of you familiar with the town centre, all the transport links are located to the north. The town centre are these sort of white blocks you see in the middle, but actually is quite a dispersed town centre. So there are 2 shopping centres in those white blocks, but actually a huge amount of retail on the periphery. And then to the bottom left-hand side, St Petersfield Office Quarter is a relatively new business centre development that has, it was hugely advanced technologically, so it was one of the first locations to get 5G connection. And really the purpose of that development was to bring new investment into the town centre, new businesses, and actually really reposition Ashton as a location that could support new and emerging technology businesses within its core. Ashton is about 15-minute train from Manchester, so the sort of long-term view for the long-term ambitions from Ashton Council was actually to bring some of the businesses located in Manchester to Ashton and essentially shape a town centre to enable that and to support the essentially the move of those new businesses from Manchester to Ashton. What we can see here, however, is actually, really that the pedestrian footfall is concentrated in the core of Ashton town centre. So it's the vast majority of movement that we see is really around that retail core, around the shopping centres. But there's really as you can see, a disconnect between pedestrian flow from the transport links to the north, but also very much between the St Petersfield Office Quarter and the town centre. So clearly those using the St Petersfield Office Quarter and the new businesses are not moving, at least on foot, from that area to the town centre. So there's a question mark whether that is actually benefiting the local economy of Ashton at all, which is obviously one of the key outputs and requirements of this relatively large capital investment that the council have made in the development of that office quarter. So we've looked at public transport. So actually this is one of the outputs from the survey. So we asked people, how they visit the town centre. Really encouragingly, 39% of visitors arrive by public transport. However, a relatively large proportion of people visiting by car, which is to be expected, and actually interesting, quite a lot of people visiting on foot. So again, alludes to the fact there are a lot of very, very local resident visitors using Ashton Town Centre. We looked at then, what some of the sort of key attractors to really understand pedestrian flow. We saw that there was a really high level of concentration of pedestrian flow around the retail locations. So we looked at a couple of other key locations, which were the library and the town hall and the college in Ashton Town Centre, to really try to understand actually, where else people were going. So those who were using both the retail elements as well as the library, town hall and the college, what were their movements around the town centre? And we found that actually the primary facilities being those locations, there was a really low percentage of those users actually using public transport, a low percentage of those users actually walking to those locations. And the reason for that was actually the immense level of car parking in the town centre. So here we've mapped out all the car parks. You can see quite how much parking there is in Ashton Town Centre, which is obviously contributing to the fact that there was a higher proportion of air pollution than the national average. But actually, one of the key reasons for which there was really poor connectivity on foot around the town centre, and one of the key locations being the office quarter, was actually the fact that so much access to parking facilitates access, yes, to the town centre, with 38% of people accessing the town centre by car, but it hugely limits movement around the town centre. So what we were finding is people were driving to the location they wanted to, just using that area, getting back in their car and potentially driving to the next area or just going home. So there was a real lack of connectivity. And again, this is what we found, in St. Petersfield Quarter, people were just driving to work, getting back in their car and leaving. So actually all of that potential economic benefit that came from having increased footfall in the town centre, through new initiatives that the council were funding and supporting, and there was no real positive impact because of the propensity of people driving to those locations. Then we looked at some of the transport hubs that we saw to the north, the transport hubs that were really well used. We can see the bus station, the train station, the metro link really drew a huge number of visitors every year. But we looked at actually then how people using the transport links use the town centre. What we did find was that only a very small proportion of people using those transport links were using the town centre. So if you remember a couple of slides ago, the analysis, we saw that some of those key footfall drivers, so the retail core, as well as the college and the library, not a huge amount of people we saw were actually using the transport links. We've done the same analysis, but backwards, just to verify that data, and we have confirmed that actually those using the transport links are actually primarily using those links to travel outside of Ashton. So really the positioning of those transport hubs and the essentially sort of double negative of there being a huge amount of parking around those transport hubs has essentially meant that the vast majority of users using those transport hubs are just commuters. And here again, if you look at the peak times that those locations are used, so for the bus station around 8:30 to 4 p.m, but for the trains 8 to 6. Again, that just reinforces the fact that most people are using those transport hubs for commuting purposes only. And then rather than using the town centres in the evening, there's obviously a big missed opportunity to retain that footfall in the evening and drive an evening economy in Ashton. They are just getting in their cars again and leaving the town centre. So a real missed opportunity to capitalise both on the footfall that we're seeing from commuters, as well as the new business districts introduced in Ashton. So again, just to reinforce that point, the disconnect is really significant here in Ashton, and there's a real missed opportunity that needs to be addressed in terms of some of the plans and some of the town centre strategies that the council should be considering. So we've taken a step back from looking at the individual street level footfall and that connection, just to look at footfall as a whole. So actually, we have seen that there's a bit of a drop in footfall year on year in Ashton. As we mentioned before, we were looking at the transport hubs. A lot of that is due to the fact that there's a declining engagement in Ashton Town Centre, and a couple of slides time we'll investigate why that is. And actually a really significant amount of people just using Ashton as a sort of commuter, sort of everyday town, but actually most people are fulfilling their retail, service, amenity, leisure and entertainment needs elsewhere, primarily in Manchester. So we could see that actually there was 81% leakage of Ashton residents to Manchester, and a real need to retain a little bit more of that spend, of that engagement in the town centre, rather than driving it all out to the west in Manchester. So again, just to illustrate the point that I just made, footfall decline in Ashton. Why was there footfall decline in Ashton? One of the things that we've seen here when we map out some of those changes in catchments is that actually the majority of the decline, yes, comes from the locations that are nearer and in closer proximity to Manchester, but actually importantly, who are the people who live there? Actually, the major decline is coming from those areas that are slightly more affluent in terms of residents, which essentially also leads to the fact that Ashton's not really catering for that resident base. So Ashton Town Centre, again, losing footfall because its alignment is not quite matching the requirements and the needs of local residents to drive that engagement and keep footfall consistent, or hopefully increasing in years to come. So again, we investigated, getting a little bit deeper now into what's happened to Ashton Town Centre to ensure that it's not really positioned in a way to drive and capture footfall. So some of the things we saw, was that there are a lot of peripheral uses outside of the town centre. So the supermarkets are located outside the town centre. There is a huge amount of retail. We'll delve into that in a moment. There are some out of town centres and retail parks that are, again, because of the propensity of people driving in Ashton, that encouragement to park and use your car rather than use public transport or walk has meant that actually lots of people are driving to the out of town centres and retail parks rather than coming into Ashton for their retail needs. There's a lack of pedestrianisation, of course, high traffic because of car usage, and other impacts in terms of edge of town retail. And what that's meant is looking at the local area. So the figures that you can see on the top right-hand side is that out of all of the sort of greater Manchester towns to the east of Manchester, Ashton has actually seen some of the highest levels of footfall decline because of that sort of lack of alignment and understanding of what local residents and residents within the catchment really want out of the space. We mentioned why there was a large sort of footfall decline in the town centre. And I think the graph at the bottom really illustrates that, is that pretty much in all retail sectors there's been a decline in footfall, so a huge amount of decline in terms of people engaging with services, with retail and with leisure and entertainment activities. However, what we did find, despite all of that, is that a lot of people were still coming to Ashton Town Centre for retail purposes. 56% of respondents for our survey actually said that the key reason for them visiting Ashton was still shopping, although 14% of those respondents said the only reason that they were coming to Ashton was because it was convenient rather than going to Manchester. But actually, the fact that the majority of people are still coming to Ashton for retail purposes meant that when we've seen such a decline in retail footfall, that's got to mean an overall significant decline in the number of people visiting Ashton Town Centre. So really, we've sort of deduced the fact that one of the key reasons for that decline has been because of actually an overall decline in retail when it's such a retail heavy town centre. And you can see here quite how much retail there is on the map. And again, another investigation into Ashton's retail floor space. So again, delving into actually quite how much retail Ashton has, we essentially were able to understand using benchmarking and actually, this publicly available information that actually Ashton Town Centre had about double the retail space of the other northwest towns. So that actually explains some of the figures we were seeing when we compared Ashton footfall decline to some of those other locations outside Greater Manchester. And actually that about 63% of all occupiable floor space in the town centre was retail. As we said, that's sort of 50% higher than the national average, but also means that when people are changing their behaviours and changing the way that they engage with the space and actually preferring to engage in retailing outside of Ashton, so both in Manchester and on the internet, all of the occupiers in the town centre are suffering, and there is far less footfall drivers in the town centre outside of retail to make up for the loss of footfall that we saw in the retail.
Sorry, Isabel, sorry to interrupt. We're just coming up to 10:02 now.
Sorry,
no problem. It's being recorded anyway, so carry on with the presentation. We'll leave the questions until later on. But I know you just had some really interesting stuff in the content that you wanted to present at the end as well. So just wanted to let you know that we are coming up to 10:02.
Brilliant, thank you. So I whiz through this. So just a couple of key takeaways. So again, we looked at what retail was really underperforming. What we're able to deduce is actually that the key sort of element of underperforming retail was Ashton Market Square. Again, we then looked at what was performing well in terms of specific occupiers, and what we could see actually was, although there was a pretty sort of marked decline in engagement for most elements of retail, what we could see actually was that there was an increase in the number of people engaging with restaurants. And although restaurants only drove 3% of footfall, quite an interesting increase, which alluded to an increase in demand for restaurants. So how do we combine the two? Summary of what we know so far. How do we combine the two? Well, we look at how we can look at increased demand with a failing retail asset. So again, some survey responses that we had from people essentially saying that that they really had a lot of pride in their market. They liked the cultural and heritage element. Again, we've done an investigation into the built heritage environment. And actually looked at then some positive examples, both in terms of Ashton. So here we've looked at the old baths that have been transformed into a sort of hub for new businesses. But actually then looking outside of Ashton, what have people done with their heritage buildings that have helped drive footfall and engagement? Again, we're able to really delve into that and what people's wants and needs were. Just taking a bit of a step back from restaurants, obviously restaurants, we could see from the data there was an increase in engagement, but actually what did people want? And we were able to understand that actually
I think we've lost connection right there. I'm not sure if you can hear me, Isabel, or if anybody who's attending today could just pop a message in the chat just to confirm that it's not only me that's lost connection. yeah, so it seems like the connection's lost for everybody. It might be a problem on Isabel's, and then, oh yeah, and she's disappeared. We'll wait a few minutes to see if she's able to come back. I don't know if in the meantime some of you want to pop any questions that you might have into the chat, so that when she does get back in, we'll be able to ask those questions to her. Oh, here she is. Sorry, Isabel, I think we lost you there, and you're still on mute at the moment.
Oh, sorry, huge apologies all. I will swiftly share my screen and we will kick back off from where we left off. Right, sorry, whizzing through the last elements of my presentation. So, as I said, we knew that the historic town centre, the historic marketplace was of importance and significance to the residents. We know they wanted bars, eateries, and there was an increased demand in terms of restaurants. So we've looked at actually understanding what impact that might have if we were to combine the two elements by looking at examples from other locations. So we looked at Altrincham. We're able to look at that as a case study, so use some geolocation data to essentially, ascertain the success and the increase in footfall engagement when there was a transformation of the market hall into a food hall. And then we took another example, so Mackie Mayor in Manchester, where there was a similar intervention, and we were able to really understand that drove an increase in 24% in footfall. So again, one of the the key outputs that we wanted from some of those town centre interventions was increase in footfall. So actually, one of these this option was actually really relevant to the demand and in keeping with the historic and cultural elements, as well as hopefully also helping to drive footfall in the town centre. Another element we'll look at, and I think I'll finish on this in terms of some of the examples, but it was also healthcare. I know this is something being considered in Bangor Town Centre, and using very similar data, we're able to ascertain where healthcare was located, and as you can see from the map, not a huge amount of healthcare facilities available in the town centre. But again, take an example where healthcare and the introduction of a health centre has had a really positive impact in the town centre. So a project we did in Chatham, where we relocated a town centre from the outskirts of the town into a redundant first floor of the shopping centre. Again, this was a council-led, council-owned scheme and a council-led project, but we were able to quantify the fact that the introduction of that healthcare centre would drive approximately an extra 1 million people into the town centre in terms of 1 million visits a year. And actually, we're really starting to see that projects completed, the real positive impact of having an occupier that's a non-retail occupier in the town centre, both in terms of footfall, but in terms of positive impact to existing occupiers in the town centre and in that space. So very conscious of time, I'll send these slides around for you afterwards so you can really read through. But this is essentially some of the outputs and some of the suggestions that we're able to give Ashton Town Centre team and the repositioning team. And essentially they were able to really rank how those interventions would have the most positive impact in their town centre, and as a result really focus their plan on interventions that would have the most impact, both in terms of footfall but also economic growth of the town centre, connectivity and usability and engagement. So yeah, just in summary, some of the takeaways, is around using footfall data to really drive data-driven decision making, is around having detailed and localized data, so data that's very local to your town, so that you can understand what changes mean at local level, as well as the introduction of benchmarking data. having diverse data sources, but also an integrated approach to using data to really gain an understanding of what town centre strategies and investment are really going to drive the most change in your locations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just conscious of time and wanted to give you the opportunity really to maybe just explain the services and products that you as a company provide.
Yeah, absolutely. So conscious that we sort of whisked through that earlier, and what I will do is give you a bit of a more comprehensive overview in the form of some documentation when I share these slides with you after the presentation. But essentially, the geolocation data that we gather is data that is emitted from handheld devices. And essentially, the data is a ping between your device and a satellite that is able to then understand where that device is at any given time. Also, just a caveat, entirely GDPR compliant, and all devices are anonymous. But what that gives us is a picture of human movement over time of the entirety of the UK. So one of the questions in the Q&A is around, restrictions of collection of that data using these methods. We use over 100 different data sources to collect that information. In terms of restrictions, the restrictions are only in terms of granularity and detail of the data. Everything we collect in terms of the data, in terms of the location of your device, as I mentioned, is anonymous. You also give consent for all of the devices to share and commercialize your data. So it's something that you will have signed in your T's and C's, either of your Apple or Android phone or your smartwatch, as well as the applications that you might have on that device. And actually, that obviously is giving a picture of people who have handheld devices, but that's obviously not going to be an entire representation of every single person in the population. So the way that we're able to extrapolate that data up to give a sample that is actually fully representative of 100% of the UK population is by using an AI platform that we process that data through. So we actually process about 70 billion data points a year, but we do that using AI, where we can actually put algorithms to really model up human behavior. Equally, that enables us to understand and have coverage of all of the UK, which is also inclusive of rural areas. We've done, projects that range in terms of density of population to really dense cities, but actually all the way up to national parks, where there, as you can imagine, is a really low amount of footfall and of devices moving around that space. But we're able to look at any areas, whether they're densely populated or rural. One of the other questions that's just popped up in terms of differentiation between activities. So in terms of our data set, it is a question that we are asked all the time. We just focus on pedestrian movement. So that means a lot of the algorithms that we use are there to remove people who are in a car. So that's even if you're in a traffic jam, we're able to understand that your device has moved at varying speeds throughout the journey. So you'd be omitted from the data set if you are traveling faster than at a sort of average walking or running pace. So as a result, we're not able to differentiate between other methods of transport other than walking. Cycling is always an interesting one. We'd love to have cycling data in there, but the problem is with people cycling is that they can cycle either slowly or relatively fast. So we wouldn't be able to differentiate whether, as a cyclist, you are, a a car or a bicycle, unfortunately. But there are other providers out there. I would suggest if you're looking at cycling, if you want to gather cycling data, traffic is a little bit different, but cycling data, the best method to collect that is actually through sensors and smart sensors that are able to understand and see physically that somebody is on a bike. That's probably the best method of collecting cycling data. But again, all of this data, again, can be used in conjunction with one another. So all of the different data sources that you have, you really should ensure that either the providers are working together or they're aware of each other, or you have some sort of centralized team or person that is really collecting data and actually analyzing it in line with all of the other sources of information that you have.
Thank you. I think you've whizzed through all the three questions that came in there. Very good as well, because one answer led on to the other. So thank you for doing that.
It did.
I think the reason why the cycling question has come in, because obviously it's to do with bringing the emissions down. You were mentioning in Ashton how accessible all the car parks is, and Wales as a country has a big agenda now to try and encourage more forms of active travel. So I think that's why that question came in there. I wrote down a few questions, but you managed to answer one right at the end of your presentation, and it was just around how important is specificity in terms of, because every town's unique. So obviously you need a real specific data for a specific location, don't you, to be able to make kind of those decisions. You can't really generalize these data-driven decisions, can you? Because one thing might be true for a town, but then you take another town, it's got a completely different catchment area. The things that make it unique are completely different. It might still be the same sort of town, it might still be a coastal town, but you're talking about different variables contributing towards that data. So I guess having a specific location data is really important. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I keep talking about in this presentation, but having very specific data and a number of different sources of data. You might use one source of data and actually arrive at a conclusion, but actually an aggregation of different sources might show you that there's a bit of a nuance to that conclusion that isn't necessarily, what you may have seen from a singular source of data. And I say that as a sort of geolocation data provider, but my background was actually in research, using lots of different sources of data to really have a solid understanding of a place, and as you say, one that's very, very localized just to that area. Yeah.
Well, I don't think we've got any more questions that are coming through. So, you showed the Bangor dashboard and some kind of maps of Ashton. If a town who's attending this webinar today were to be interested in maybe having a report or potentially having access to some sort of dashboard, are those the things that you offer as a company?
Yeah, absolutely. So we provide data in varying different ways. So we have everything from a sort of online self-serve platform that gives you access, so pretty much live access to data and lots of different metrics, most of which you saw in the sort of Bangor dashboard. But we also provide reports either in terms of just data itself and sort of graphs and that information, all the way to pretty detailed reports where we might work with other businesses, like you saw with the Ashton report that actually was a couple of pages of something that was nearly 100 pages long, to really have that sort of end-to-end view of the data, but actually what that data means, and some solid suggestions in terms of town centre strategy. So yeah, we do all of everything that you've seen today and more.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for doing this webinar for us and answering all the questions that came in. when I finish this webinar, everybody's going to disappear, including myself. So thank you to everybody who's attended today as well. I'll make sure that the recording is shared with all of you, and then you can share that with others who might be interested. And Isabel, if you could share the slides with me, I can also distribute those when I share the link.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, and take care.